She was the girl every studio wanted to sign after Love Story broke hearts across the world. He was the man every studio wanted to insure, because nobody could be sure what he'd do next behind the wheel of a car or the barrel of a shotgun prop. When Ollie MacGraw and Steve McQueen collided on a Texas film set in the early 1970s, Hollywood assumed it was watching the birth of the decade's great romance. What almost nobody watching from the outside understood was how much that romance would eventually cost her. Her career, her sense of self, and years of her life spent quietly disappearing inside someone else's shadow. Now in her mid-80s, MacGraw has spent decades unpacking what happened behind the doors of that Malibu beach house. And the picture she paints is far rougher than the fan magazine version anyone remembers. Long before the cameras found her, Ollie MacGraw was a kid in Bedford Village, New York, learning to read her room for danger. Her household wasn't a happy one. Her father struggled with drinking, and the tension between her parents was constant enough that MacGraw grew up believing conflict was simply what love looked like. She has said in later interviews that this early environment left her without much sense of her own worth, and that she learned early to make herself small and agreeable rather than risk more chaos. That instinct to shrink herself to keep the peace would follow her for decades, long after she'd left home. As a young woman, she found an outlet in the fashion world, working her way up through the industry under the mentorship of legendary editor Diana Vreeland. That world taught her how to be looked at, how to be photographed, how to perform composure. It was, in hindsight, good training for the life that was coming. Her transition into film happened almost by accident. She landed a role in 1969's Goodbye, Columbus, and the performance was sharp enough to catch Hollywood's attention. It also caught the attention of one particular man in the audience, Robert Evans, the head of production at Paramount, a producer with an eye for talent and, evidently, for MacGraw specifically. Evans cast MacGraw in Love Story, a modest romantic drama that turned into one of the defining films of 1970. Audiences wept in theaters across the country. The line, "Love means never having to say you're sorry," became so famous it practically entered the language on its own. MacGraw, playing the doomed, sharp-tongued Jenny, became an overnight icon, and the film's massive box office take turned her into one of the most bankable actresses in America almost overnight. Off-screen, her relationship with Evans had already deepened into marriage. They wed in 1969, and by 1971, they had a son together, Joshua. On paper, MacGraw's life looked close to perfect. Critical acclaim, box office gold, a powerful husband, and motherhood, all before she'd turned 35. Friends who knew her at the time have described a woman who seemed, for once, settled. That sense of settledness didn't last. In 1972, Evans arranged for MacGraw to take a role in The Getaway, an action thriller directed by Sam Peckinpah and starring Steve McQueen, then the highest-paid actor on the planet. MacGraw would later admit that some part of her resisted the offer before she'd even met McQueen, not because of the travel or the time away from her son, but because some instinct told her the job carried a different kind of risk. In her 1991 memoir Moving Pictures, she wrote candidly that she sensed she was headed for serious trouble with McQueen before filming had even begun. She took the role anyway. Steve McQueen arrived on set already a legend. 12 years older than MacGraw, he'd clawed his way out of a genuinely brutal childhood, abandoned by his father, shuffled off by his mother, raised for stretches in a home for troubled boys, and turned that hard start into a screen persona built on danger and detachment. Audiences called him the king of cool. He raced motorcycles and cars in real life the way his characters did on screen, and that authenticity was part of what made him impossible to look away from. MacGraw has since said the pull between them was immediate and almost chemical, his word, actually, which she later borrowed to describe him. When he walked into a room, she said everyone in it noticed, regardless of age or gender. Filming in Texas threw them together constantly, and it didn't take long for the professional relationship to become something else entirely. The affair became public almost as fast as it began, and the fallout was swift. By the end of 1972, MacGraw had filed for divorce from Robert Evans, the man who had, quite literally, made her career. Evans was reportedly blindsided. Their split was messy enough and famous enough that it later became a storyline in The Offer, the streaming series dramatizing the making of The Godfather, and Evans's life at Paramount. Whatever grief MacGraw carried over ending that marriage, she moved forward into the next one with striking speed. She and McQueen married in July of 1973. The wedding had all the glamour of a Hollywood fairy tale. The marriage did not. Before they married, McQueen had MacGraw sign a prenuptial agreement stripping her of any financial claim to his fortune in the event of divorce. That was only the opening term. The bigger demand came next. McQueen wanted her to stop acting entirely. This was not a small ask. MacGraw was, at that moment, one of the biggest female stars working in American film. She had just come off Love Story. Studios were actively looking to build projects around her. And she said yes anyway, not because she'd lost interest in acting, but because she was afraid that refusing him would cost her the relationship. Decades later, she would describe that decision plainly. McQueen was the biggest movie star in the world, and he simply didn't want a wife who worked. So she stopped. What replaced her career wasn't leisure. In her own account, she effectively became a full-time domestic partner, cooking, cleaning, managing the household, raising her son Josh, and trying to anticipate McQueen's moods before they turned volatile. She has said she played the role of a simple homemaker to the hilt, throwing herself into it as completely as she'd once thrown herself into acting, as if total submersion in the role might make the sacrifice feel like a choice rather than a surrender. The early years in their secluded Malibu beach house looked idyllic from a distance. Barbecues, beach walks, a tight circle of friends. But inside the house, McQueen's unresolved history was resurfacing in the form of relentless jealousy. MacGraw has said that even the mildest, most innocent glance at another man could trigger his suspicion. The irony, which she noted herself, was that McQueen was simultaneously carrying on with other women, something that was widely rumored in Hollywood circles at the time and that MacGraw eventually had to confront directly. Isolated from her career, her professional community, and increasingly from her own sense of identity, MacGraw began drinking more than she once had. McQueen's own use of alcohol and drugs was already well established, and instead of the marriage functioning as a refuge from either person's demons, it became a place where both of their worst tendencies were left unchecked. MacGraw has since described a specific, corrosive fear that ran underneath those years, that if she ever spoke honestly about what she needed, McQueen would simply leave. So, for a long time, she didn't. Friends who visited the house during that period later described an atmosphere that shifted depending entirely on McQueen's mood that day, warm and generous one afternoon, tense and suspicious the next. MacGraw learned to read those shifts the way she'd once learned to read her parents' moods as a child, which is perhaps why the marriage felt to her both dangerously familiar and impossible to walk away from. She has reflected that part of what kept her locked in place wasn't just love for McQueen, but a much older fear of conflict itself. The same fear that had shaped her as a girl in Bedford Village, resurfacing decades later in a very different house with a very different man. By the mid-1970s, the gap between McQueen's public image and his private behavior had widened into something MacGraw could no longer ignore or absorb. Publicly, he was still the man on the movie posters, untouchable, effortlessly masculine, the face of Bullet and The Great Escape. Privately, he was disappearing for stretches into benders that left him distant, paranoid, and difficult to reach even when he was standing in the same room. MacGraw's drinking deepened alongside his. The rumors of his infidelities, which he had tried for a long time to explain away, eventually became too consistent and too numerous to dismiss. The humiliation of that realization, layered on top of years of enforced silence, pushed her toward seeking her own comfort outside the marriage as well. What had started as a passionate, headline-making romance had, by this point, curdled into a cycle of mutual resentment and betrayal that neither of them seemed able to stop. The end came in 1977, when MacGraw finally told McQueen she wanted to go back to acting. It wasn't only a professional decision. After years of silencing herself to keep him calm, it was the first real assertion of her own needs in the marriage. According to McQueen biographer Mark Elliott, McQueen's response was immediate and cold. If she wanted to work again, they would file for divorce. There was no negotiation offered. For MacGraw, the moment confirmed something she had likely suspected for years, that her voice, her ambitions, and her identity outside of being his wife had never really been welcome in that marriage to begin with. She took the role anyway, appearing in Peckinpah's Convoy the following year. A brief, half-hearted attempt at reconciliation followed, but the damage was already done. The divorce was finalized in 1978, closing out a 5-year marriage that had cost MacGraw her career, years of sobriety, and, by her own account, a great deal of her self-respect. Hollywood, never shy about turning real heartbreak into public spectacle, treated the divorce as just another chapter in the McQueen legend, proof, to some, that he really was too wild and too independent to be tamed by any one woman. Almost no one in the press framed it as what MacGraw herself has since described it as, the end of 5 years in which she'd quietly disappeared into someone else's expectations, only to be discarded the moment she tried to reclaim any part of herself. The two didn't have much time to build separate lives before tragedy intervened. In 1980, at just 50 years old, Steve McQueen died of pleural mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer linked to asbestos exposure. His death stunned an industry that had, for 2 decades, treated him as close to indestructible. For MacGraw, the grief that followed was not simple. She and McQueen had spent years hurting each other, and the marriage had ended with real bitterness on both sides. And yet she has said plainly that she loved him deeply despite everything, and that his death left a void she wasn't prepared for even though the marriage itself had ended 2 years earlier. Looking back on it decades later, she offered one of the more devastating lines of her later interviews, that she wished the two of them could have grown old together, sober. It's a wish that captures both how much she still cared for him and how clearly she understood, by then, exactly what had gone wrong between them. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from mourning someone you'd already spent years learning to live without, and MacGraw's reflections on that period suggest she was navigating exactly that. She wasn't simply losing an ex-husband. She was losing the possibility of any future resolution between them, any chance that the anger, the addiction, and the control might one day have given way to something calmer, something closer to the version of the relationship she'd hoped for when she first fell for him on that Texas film set. His death closed that door permanently, and she has said the grief of that closure was, in its own way, harder to carry than the divorce itself had been. McQueen's death didn't stop MacGraw's drinking. If anything, the grief fed it. She continued working through the 1970s and into the 1980s, taking roles in projects like Convoy and a well-remembered run on the primetime soap Dynasty. But by her own admission, the spark that had once made her Hollywood's brightest new star had dimmed considerably. She has spoken about feeling overlooked in an industry that had moved on without much sentiment, and about not having the will left to fight for the kind of roles she once would have chased. Her drinking finally reached a point by the early 1990s where she could no longer manage it. She checked herself into the Betty Ford Center, beginning a recovery process that forced her to confront not just her alcohol use, but the accumulated weight of a difficult childhood, 2 complicated marriages, and a career she'd once given up to satisfy someone else's demands. That reckoning became the foundation of her 1991 memoir, Moving Pictures, a genuinely unguarded account of her life that didn't spare herself or the people around her from honest scrutiny. The book became a bestseller, resonating with readers far beyond the world of classic film, many of whom recognized pieces of their own struggles with addiction, self-erasure, and toxic relationships in her story. By 1994, MacGraw had left Hollywood behind almost entirely, relocating to Santa Fe, New Mexico. She traded film sets for a quieter, more deliberate life centered on painting, gardening, and daily spiritual practice. It was there, away from the industry that had built and nearly broken her, that she finally found something like steady ground. Recovery, for MacGraw, wasn't a single dramatic turning point so much as a slow and often uncomfortable unlearning. She has spoken about how much of her drinking had been tied not just to grief over McQueen, but to decades of suppressing her own needs. First as a child, trying to keep her parents fighting from escalating, and later as a wife, trying to keep McQueen calm enough that he wouldn't leave. Getting sober meant sitting with all of that discomfort without a drink to soften it, and by her own account, it was some of the hardest work she's ever done. It was also, she has said, The work that finally let her stop performing a version of herself designed to please someone else and start figuring out who she actually was underneath all of it. More than 3 decades of sobriety later, MacGraw speaks about her past with a clarity that took her years to earn. She has described her younger self as someone who was constantly rewriting the past and fantasizing about a different future, and says she has since learned to simply live in the present as fully as she can. She has never remarried, choosing instead to build her life around close friendships, creative work, and self-reflection rather than another partnership. One of the more enduring of those friendships is with her love story co-star, Ryan O'Neal. The two reunited on stage in 2016 for a touring production of Love Letters, and audiences noted that their chemistry, decades later, hadn't dulled at all. It stands as one of the few relationships from that early chapter of her life that survived intact. She has also found new purpose through her partnership with Ibu, a fashion collective that works directly with female artisans around the world, helping design clothing lines rooted in traditional craftsmanship. For a woman who once gave up her entire career because a husband demanded it, the work carries an obvious symbolic weight. It's a creative identity built entirely on her own terms. What stands out most about MacGraw today isn't bitterness. She has been remarkably clear that she doesn't see herself as a victim of her years with McQueen, even while being honest about how painful and controlling that marriage was. She has described McQueen's pull on her as something almost chemical, something she recognized as dangerous from the very start and walked into anyway. But she has also refused to flatten the relationship into a simple villain and victim story, insisting instead that there were as many wonderful days in that marriage as there were genuinely awful ones. It's that refusal to simplify her own history that gives her story its staying power. Ali MacGraw isn't just remembered anymore as the young woman who broke hearts in Love Story. She's remembered as someone who survived fame